Green Gary, yeah.
Green Gary.
Okay, we're back from our break, and the topic of discussion is, do those who are here tonight get extra credit for participating in the discussion? And the answer is yes. And so we're passing around a list for those who are here who get extra credit. And Gary, you're here too, so you keep on participating, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you count.
On that list.
We'll write your name on that list, right? Okay, we put you down as Green Gary, but we'll remember who you are. You're the only Gary here. I don't know why you're green. Don told me it was something to do with the color set up there on your transmitter, but anyway. Okay.
You are in vivid color.
We're in vivid color, okay, and red tonight. I'm sure that's throwing off all the sensors. I know you're not supposed to wear red, but I had to just once. Okay, now we're going to turn to Richard Lionheart, and we have lecture 15, and we're going to look at Richard Lionheart as the hero of the Franks, just the ideal hero of the Franks, and everything about him represents Frankish culture. And we all read for tonight the Chronicle of the Third Crusade, which I think, let me check and see where we are here. I think we should have finished up the Chronicle of the Third Crusade for tonight. And the title of it is The Itinerarium Peregrinorum et Gesta Regis Ricardi, the journey and the journey of pilgrimage and the deeds of King Richard. And so this chronicle is all about Richard on the Third Crusade. I mean, the Chronicle of the Third Crusade is not the correct title. It's not the translation of what it's really called. It's called the journey and pilgrimage, the journey of the pilgrimage and the deeds of Richard. Of King Richard. And so this is a chronicle about King Richard. Other chronicles tell different stories of the Third Crusade. The other book I'm drawing on tonight, and I'm going to be drawing on 3 actually, this is one of my absolute favorite books. It's Richard Lionheart by John Gillingham, and it is a just splendid book. It is so beautifully written, and it's so concise and filled with wonderful information, wonderful stories, and he's read too. And I'm going to give you some of his little anecdotes and some of the stories from Richard Lionheart tonight. And of course, Richard Lionheart had a life besides the crusade. You know, he did other things besides just go on the crusade. And then I have a book of some of the troubadour poems that Richard, of course, came from the south and the troubadour area, and he and his mother were involved in that, and so I'll give you some information on that. Okay, why don't we start by looking at some of the things that we did with Saladin. I suggested that Richard is a hero for the Franks. And what makes Richard a hero? What are the qualities that make Richard a hero? What is he like?
Besides being a royal stock, that's always a good grounds for being a hero. But also, he was very zealous in the crusading movement. He was the first to take the cross.
Yes,
with the calling of the Third Crusade.
Yeah, he was zealous in taking the cross and calling the Third Crusade. He jumped right in, and he was going to be the first one to go off there and carry the crusade. What other qualities did Richard have? Some are too obvious almost for you to think about. I mean, but what are the obvious qualities he had?
He's recorded as being bold and daring and a military genius for his time.
Yes, bold and daring and a military genius. So he's a great commander, and he's a great strategist, and he wins lots of battles, and he's a good soldier. I mean, he's a warrior. He's a heroic warrior, and he fights well. He charges into the battle himself. And Sandra, did you have any comments too? Press your mic. Okay.
He was very, very, very courageous.
Yeah.
Always one of the first people in battle, last ones to leave.
And he's daring too. I mean, he does daring things. He doesn't hold back. He's not conservative. I mean, he leaps into the breach. He's really like that. Any other particular characteristics that you see in Richard? Yeah.
Did we mention virtuous?
Yes, he's very virtuous. He is virtuous. We did not mention that.
I was going to mention that the historian went to some detail about his physique. Talking about even going as far as describing the color of his hair and his beard.
Okay.
And kind of making a romantic ideal out of Richard. I mean, besides him being a great historical figure, he's also a great romantic figure as well.
Okay, he's a romantic ideal. His physical appearance is important to the Franks. I don't recall seeing any physical description of Saladin. Did you? Do you remember seeing one? No, but here is Richard, and a physical appearance of being handsome and being strong and a good physique and the color of his hair and his beard and all of that. This is important to the Franks, and in fact, physical descriptions are something we find in a lot of chronicles. Travis?
It also seems like he's a little bit flamboyant. He likes to make an entrance.
Yes, he does. What would you attribute this to? I mean, why would they want to see him be flamboyant?
Why would
the Franks want to see their heroes be flamboyant? Why would they praise something like that or describe it?
It shows a part of his character. And he's the king and the leader, and so he wants to be seen. They
seem to like their leaders to be flamboyant, to be regal in the sense of putting on a big display. Mary, did you have a comment on this? Sandra, I'm sorry. Okay.
I think it shows a great deal of confidence to be able to be flamboyant and be able to make the entrances that he does. A lot of confidence to pull it off.
Yeah, he does have that kind of confidence. That's right. Yeah. Any other comments on the kind of he's virtuous, but he's virtuous like Saladin was, and so he shows this virtue. I can't remember reading any kinds of flaws that are being. But then this chronicle is much less, it's much more factual than the other one. Don't you think it's more factual? It doesn't give these sort of flamboyant comments about this or that and judgments, value judgments that you have in the other one. Did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I was going to say that there have been certain times when it became almost extremely tedious to the point of boredom to read some of the accounts in the Arab historians, especially when you would. I can't remember the name of that one historian who would spend half a page describing one little incident.
Oh, okay. Well, how did you like the Chronicle of the Third Crusade and the way it told its story? Did you enjoy reading it? Was it an adventure story? Or what did you think? Any comments on the kind of story it was?
It was an adventure story in and of itself. I mean, aside from having historical value, I mean, if nothing else, take a look at the exploits of Barbarossa up until the time he drowns.
Yeah, up until he drowns. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of an exciting adventure story. I think that tells it's long, and it's involved. It's quite long for a chronicle, which is kind of amazing. But it's a blow-by-blow account. I mean, you get all the details of what happened. Okay. Well, why don't I give you some background on Richard and give you some. I want to sort of start with reading something from John Gillingham, who I studied with John Gillingham in London 30 years ago. He's retired now, but he is a wonderful historian. All his books are so vividly written. But he starts out by talking about the Lionheart of legend. More than any other king of England, Richard the Lionheart belongs not to the sober world of history, but to the magic realm of legend and romance. The picture we have of him is still shaped by the images of a child's view of the Middle Ages: knights in armor, crusaders fighting a desert war beneath a burning sun, minstrels, forest lairs, and castle dungeons. Most historians, on reaching adult years, cast aside their childhood fantasies and turn instead to themes which they believe to be of greater significance. They write about castles as though they were banks where treasure was stored and accounted for by office clerks, not as military strongholds where men performed deeds of courage or cowardice, of loyalty or treachery. In reality, castles were both these things. And he goes on to say that increasingly, historians write about that sort of accountant, bankish side of things and look at society more in terms of society and government rather than the drama of the struggles between Richard and Philip Augustus in Saladin. In other words, they prefer to study man as a socio-political animal rather than as a fighting animal, though of course he is both these things. Indeed, in the opinion of a highly cultivated 12th century Arab, Usama, Europeans were animals who were good at fighting but nothing else. Okay. Naturally, no one will deny that the underlying structures of economy and society, government and administration, and religious and secular thought are all important subjects and that grown-ups ought to study them. But we should also recognize that as a result, historians have turned their backs on a king who was at home on the battlefield. Okay, so then he goes on with his biography of Richard Lionheart, and in truth, Richard spent his whole life on the battlefield. I mean, he wasn't involved in government, and he wasn't involved in treaties and diplomacy and bureaucratic affairs, but he spent his entire life fighting. And this is really quite interesting, I think. He was truly a warrior in every sense of the word. And the other problem with Richard Lionheart is that, we saw that in the Muslim world, Saladin is so central. He's clearly their hero, and they're going to latch onto him, and they spend more time on Saladin than any other historical figure. Okay, not true with Richard Lionheart. In fact, he's been very neglected in the historiography, except by crusading authors who only deal with the crusade. And the reason is because he doesn't seem to belong anywhere. I mean, the English historians sort of leave him alone because he spent most of his life in France and on crusade. He spent very little time in England. The French historians kind of leave him alone because they figure he's an English king, but he's not. I mean, he's much more French than he is English, and so nobody writes about him. And so John Gillingham is really filling in, a vacuum here. Yeah, Carlos.
Was he as fanatic as Saladin was to his religion?
No, I don't think he was as fanatical, but we'll kind of look at what he did. He was more like the Franks in general, who were not as fanatical in their religion as the Muslims were.
Because he comes across as someone who's more believable than Saladin.
You think he's more believable? That's interesting.
More human-like. The other guy, he comes across as someone who was spent most of his time trying to please people, doing all these things for different people and kind of... Yeah. That's just the way I view it.
Well, but remember, we don't know what they were really like. All we know is what these historians say about them. And so both of them were probably somewhat different in reality. Yeah.
It seemed to me like the Arab historians were playing up Saladin, sort of trumped up version is what we have now.
Yeah. And you don't think that they're trumping up Richard as much in this?
Not as much at all.
Not as much in the Chronicle. But he's clearly the hero. I mean, it's the deeds of Richard. But they don't go overboard in praising him. They just sort of show his deeds, and then you make your own decision from what he does, I think is what this chronicler tries to have you do. Do you think so?
By the same token, again, it goes along with the different ideas. I mean, the Arab historians there, or Saladin, he's much more flamboyantly romanticized. It's partially, I think, maybe a cultural kind of thing.
Yeah, but the funny thing about Richard, and I'll kind of say that before I go on and sort of tell some other things about his story. But the funny thing about Richard is since he's so different from all the other kings of England, and he's really different from the kings of France and a lot of the other lords of France. He's just a different kind of guy. And one historian has, or a lot of people think he might have been gay, and I think they're totally off. I mean, you cannot. In the Middle Ages, a gay lifestyle was impossible for anybody. Nobody could have been gay the way people are gay today. I mean, it's just impossible. Even if they had gay feelings, they would have married anyway because they had to have heirs. I mean, the customs in that time were so different from today. And I just think even to say he had gay tendencies is pure speculation without any evidence at all. And the one reason they think he was gay is because he liked to sing and dance and he wrote poetry. And I don't see that as grounds for saying he was gay. And there was one piece of evidence that was supposedly when Philip Augustus came on crusade, he and Richard Lionheart slept in the same bed. And that's supposed to make him gay. I mean, I just don't believe it. I think this, because lots of travelers, when they would go traveling in Europe, a lot of times they would sleep in the same bed. I mean, people did that. And so there's no evidence that I can see that he was gay. And so I don't believe it, but you know, you might read what they have to say if anybody's interested in following that up. But here he is. He falls in the cracks. For everybody who does conventional history, Richard sort of falls through the cracks and he doesn't fit in anywhere. It's in part because Richard ruled even that venerable, if misleading, academic tradition which places kings at the center of the story of the development of nations like England and France has not saved Richard from the neglect of historians. In part, this is because most academics have come to value more highly the king who is a crowned civil servant rather than a frontline soldier. But in part, it is also because Richard ruled a political structure that no longer exists and which indeed began to break up immediately after his death, the Angevin Empire. Today, we think and write in political categories like England and France, and if we are historically minded, we may be interested in the past of these countries. And where does that leave Richard? I mean, in between. He's not one and he's not the other. Although he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, he has never attracted the attention of students of English history because he spent his whole life abroad. In his 10-year reign, he spent only 6 months in England. He stands accused of neglecting his kingdom. On the other side of the Channel, French historians are interested either in regional studies or in the rise of the Capetian monarchy. If the former, they may write about social change in 12th century Anjou, but they are less inclined to write about the empire built up by the Counts of Anjou, since that sprawling conglomeration of territories was so much more ephemeral than the individual provinces. Okay. Only the crusading historians have considered him seriously, but he spent little more than a year in Outremer, the land of the Crusaders, and in that time he did not recapture Jerusalem. So he doesn't fit into anybody's field of study. And so here, but in order to write this biography of Richard Lionheart, John Gillingham had to master all these different fields. So for 800 years, Richard has been left in the hands of the myth makers. Okay. It is only in the last 30 years that the story has gone around that Richard was a homosexual. Although this is now generally accepted as the plain, unvarnished truth about Richard, repeated in works as staid as the Encyclopedia Britannica, it is in fact no more than a highly colored assertion which cannot be substantiated. In other words, that is also a new legend. Okay, but we can go on about the legends, but this is just a wonderful, wonderful, very colorful book, and I've taken a lot of the information from it, on Richard's background from it. He was the son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and this, of course, was her second marriage. In her first marriage, she was married to Louis VII, King of France, and we remember her because she went on crusade with Louis VII on the Second Crusade. She and all her women dressed in armor rode off to the crusade. The Angevin Empire was the empire ruled by Henry II, and more of it is in France. More of France is in the Angevin Empire than the King of France held or ruled. And we'll look at a map of the Angevin Empire in a moment. Richard himself was born on the 8th of September in 1157 at Oxford. He was the third of 5 sons. William was the first, who died in 1156, so he died young. Henry also died as a young man, and then Richard, who ended up inheriting the kingdom. Geoffrey died after that, and later John inherited the kingdom from Richard because Richard had no children. Henry II was an intelligent and well-educated man who enjoyed argument and conversation. And here I want to show you a genealogy, and we'll have these on the web for you. I want to work on this a little bit more and put a little more into it, but here we can see the descent of Richard Lionheart. William the Conqueror was king. There's a break between Edward the Confessor and William the Conqueror, and here are his sons. Henry I became king after William Rufus died, and he had Matilda, the Empress Matilda, fought a civil war to be king, to be queen, and Stephen actually won. Then the inheritance passed to Henry II, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine after she married Louis VII of France. And interestingly, the Anglo-Norman state that Henry I ruled was much smaller than the Angevin Empire, because at least half of the Angevin Empire was brought by Eleanor of Aquitaine as her inheritance. And so whereas Henry I and William the Conqueror had called the kingdom, they called themselves just King of England and regarded themselves as king, and after they became king, they rarely spoke of themselves as Duke of Normandy. Henry II separated out his realms as Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Count of Maine, Count of Brittany, and then Eleanor's realms were separate from that. Richard Lionheart here shows on the genealogy. I forgot to put Geoffrey on here. Okay, and here is a picture of Henry II, King of England, as a warrior. And Henry II loved to carry on conversations, whether in French or in Latin, which he was fluent in both French and Latin. He was addicted to hunting and more comfortable in hunting clothes than in court. But he was a distant figure for his children. He spent most of his time in France, and he was always traveling around, and the children stayed at home. And Richard rarely saw either his mother or his father. He saw neither one, because Eleanor, of course, turned him over to a wet nurse, Hodierne, who he later rewarded when he became king by making her a rich woman. So he spent most of his childhood with the wet nurse. Eleanor was in her territory, which was as big as Henry's, and she was governing it, so she didn't spend any time with all these children, raising them. They were all raised by wet nurses. But in May 1165, Eleanor took Richard and his elder sister Matilda, who was a year older than Richard, to Normandy. And at the same time, Henry crossed to England, so neither one of them saw their father. And as I said, Richard was probably raised by a wet nurse, Hodierne, whom he rewarded when he became king. Gillingham has been able to reconstruct his education. He probably was taught to ride as soon as he could walk, because that's what happened to most of the young boys at the Angevin court. At first, he would have remained chiefly in the care of women, and here is the seal of Richard Lionheart, as he was when he was king. He would have been learned under these women how to behave, how to speak in a courtly fashion, and when to keep silent, and how to play and how to sing, because playing a musical instrument was very important at that time, especially since Eleanor came from the courtly love area of southern France. But at 5 or 6, Richard would have entered a masculine world where his formal schooling began. He ended up, when he grew up, being capable of composing his own songs, so he could compose music and he could read and write. He wrote verse in both French and Provençal. He was also fluent in Latin because he enjoyed sacred music, and when the clerks of his royal chapel were singing in the choir, he would often walk among them, urging them with voice and hand to sing with greater gusto. In fact, he was so well educated in Latin that he cracked a Latin joke at the expense of the less learned Archbishop of Canterbury. And this, of course, upset the Archbishop of Canterbury. I don't know if I wrote the joke down or not. But here's a picture of Tristan at the chase, showing the hunting that was the activity of all the nobles of Europe at this time. This was their greatest activity. Another activity that they all engaged in was playing chess, by the way, which is a game of strategy. Does anybody here play chess? It's kind of a game of military strategy, isn't it? And so you can see why this warrior society would want to play chess. So hunting and chess, and here are the hunting dogs, of course, which are a major part of this society. Richard learned the knightly art of fighting on horseback with lances, which was hard for both horses and men, because they had to learn to gallop their horses forward and to hit the opponent at just the right place without being knocked off of their horses, and to control their horses. The horses needed to be specially trained to gallop forward right into someone else, an enemy charging at them, and they had to keep their balance in the saddle and hit with the lance just right, or they would be knocked off their own horse, and then once you're knocked off your horse, you're out of the battle. The best training for the time was tournaments, which were mock battles, not one-on-one, as we tend to think of the jousts, which were much later. But in this period, they didn't have jousts, one-on-one combat, but rather they fought in teams, and they fought warfare in the way I've sort of described to you before, but let me read to you Gillingham's description of warfare, if I can find it here. Okay, probably I can't find it. I might not have put a marker in it, I'm sorry. Oh, here it is, yeah. Making war in the 12th century was rather like going on strike in the 20th. It was a method of exerting economic and financial pressure on your opponent. It was not intended that it should end in his death. By devastating his fields, orchards, and vineyards, you hoped to force him to listen to a case which he was otherwise disposed to ignore. By military means, he was to be compelled to come to terms. It was a regrettable side effect of such disputes that the general public suffered. Villagers might see their homes and livelihoods destroyed. They might be hurt or occasionally even killed. But how else was their lord to be brought to reason or to arbitration except by ensuring that he could not collect his rents? So what they essentially did was the team would go in and ravage the land of their enemies. And they would aim to take people prisoner, but not to kill them. Okay, so this is the way that wars, mock combat and real combat in Europe was carried out, that they would do that. Here's another description of some of the training. This is the description of Tristan's education that comes from another source, but this is probably the education that Richard had. In his 7th year, his foster father took him and placed him in the care of a man of experience and promptly sent him abroad with him to learn foreign languages and begin at once to study books. This was his first loss of freedom. Just when he was entering the springtime of life, his best life was over. He had tasted freedom only to lose it. Now he had to face cares and obligations which had been unknown to him before, and the beginning of his cares lay in the stern discipline of the study of books. Yet once he had started, he applied his mind and industry to it with such vigor that he had mastered more books in that short space than any child before or since. He also spent many hours playing stringed instruments of all kinds, persevering from morning to night until he became marvelously adept at them. He was learning the whole time, today one thing, tomorrow another, this year well, the next year better. Tristan, of course, was a child prodigy, but Richard had some kind of an education like that. In fact, we were talking about the tournaments, the mock battles with teams of knights that often devastated the countryside. They were held in France about every 2 weeks, and so the countryside was routinely devastated. In fact, Henry II banned them in England, as had his grandfather Henry I. But interestingly, when Richard became king, he restored them, so that tournaments were fought so he could train his knights in England. So he restored them. The political and moral education that Richard had came from the chansons de geste sung by minstrels, tales of legendary warriors like the Song of Roland, which told about Roland's battle as the rear guard of Charlemagne's army, fighting against the Muslims and dying bravely for Charlemagne's sake. Guillaume d'Orange, who was another hero like that. King Arthur and all the Arthurian tales. Charlemagne as a great legendary hero, not the true Charlemagne that we know about, but the legends that were all built up about Charlemagne. And all of these heroes, these legendary warriors, engaged in great conquest and deeds of arms and chivalry, and they became the pattern for boys to learn how to behave, how to be chivalrous, how to fight for your honor, how to be loyal to your lord, how to fight for God and for God's sake. All of these things, like in the Song of Roland, you would find in there. And here is the Battle of Roncesvalles and the death of Roland from the stained glass, showing, Roland, the Song of Roland shows single combat, the warriors fighting in single combat. This is a Muslim, and this is Roland fighting. And here are some other scenes. This is Roland, I think, has a halo around his head here. They're showing him almost as a saint. And here they are in the great battles. And here is the famous incident where Roland blows his horn and his brain runs out his ears because he blew it so hard, and to summon Charlemagne, but he waited until too late, and so all of them were killed, and Charlemagne had to avenge the death of his faithful peers of the realm. And so these are the stories that he was raised on. Here is Roland at Roncesvalles, and this is Oliver, who is his companion, his sort of alter ego, and the piles of dead all around them. Okay. And here is King Arthur's court with the round table. Again, he would have been raised on those stories of Arthur, the Arthurian legends that tell about gallantry and bravery and the quest for the Holy Grail and fighting for your lord and rescuing your lady. And all of these heroic tales were where he would have learned his ethics and morals and his kind of moral code. A sense of honor and a sense of shame, and the shame he would have felt for dishonoring either his lord or his lady or his church or his country. Though he must die, he would have learned his name need not. If he could be like Roland or Charlemagne or Arthur or any of the Arthurian knights like Lancelot, then his name would also last forever. And Richard learned his lesson well, because his name has lasted forever. But the other thing he learned was that it was up to him. You know, he made his own good or evil reputation. It was up to him, and his actions were going to make his reputation. These were knightly values. They weren't religious, they weren't clerical, but they were more based on the code of chivalry. But he also received a religious education. He was assiduous in attending Mass, and he delighted in the music and the ceremony. And one of the things about the Mass is the ritual exalted kings. And so especially after he became king, I mean, he would sit on the throne and just glory in all the exaltation that the coronation ceremony or the mass would give him as king. He truly did like elaborate ceremony, and you all notice that in this chronicle. He also appreciated the administrative value of the clergy because they are the ones who ran the bureaucracy. They were the ones who wrote all the charters and the writs, and they were the ones who wrote the letters and who took care of all the accounting things. Fulk of Neuilly, the most famous preacher of the time, accused Richard of having 3 wicked daughters, pride, avarice, and sensuality. And Richard replied that he would give his pride to the Templars, his avarice to the Cistercians, and his sensuality to bishops and abbots. Okay, now that is a joke. And so what he did was turn that around and put the blame on other people who he thought were worse than he was. He was also a generous benefactor to the Cistercians and the Benedictines. He gave a lot of expensive gifts to Cistercian abbeys and Benedictine abbeys. His parents, however, expected him to undertake the role of a pawn in the diplomatic game. Diplomacy revolved around family relationships of princely dynasties, and children, especially princes and princesses, were expected to be betrothed early. Richard's brother Henry was betrothed at the age of 3 to Margaret, daughter of Louis VII of France, by his second wife. Margaret was still a baby at that time. She was to be raised at Henry II's court, and her dowry was the Norman Vexin, which was a very strategic part of the Norman holdings. And so it had been won back by the kings of France, and Henry II was very eager to get it, which was why he arranged this marriage. In 1159, Richard was betrothed to a daughter of Raymond Berengar IV, Count of Barcelona, and Raymond Berengar was the husband of the Queen of Aragon, and he ruled Aragon in his wife's name. And when he was asked why he didn't become King of Aragon and rule as a king, he said, "I'd rather be a first-rate count than a seventh-rate king." The King of Aragon wasn't powerful or important as the King of England or the King of France, and so he said he preferred to be a count. Well, the couple, Richard and the daughter of Raymond Berengar, was to be granted Aquitaine on their marriage. And Aquitaine, of course, was Eleanor's land, and through Eleanor's grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, Eleanor had a claim to Toulouse, and Raymond Berengar IV was also at war with Toulouse, and so this marriage unified the two allies against the King of France, who was the overlord of Raymond of Toulouse, and so they aimed to grab Toulouse and unite it to Aquitaine. Raymond of Toulouse was married to Louis VII's sister, Constance, who I've spelled wrong there. He was married to his sister Constance, and so Raymond of Toulouse was allied to Louis VII, and this made Henry an ally of Raymond Berengar, and they fought a war against the King of France to get Toulouse. Nothing came of this betrothal, but it marked the beginning of Richard's association with Aquitaine. And Aquitaine was larger than Henry's Norman and Angevin lands put together, and so Aquitaine was incredibly important. I'm going to show you some pictures here. Here is a map. This is England and Normandy. If you can see the Anglo-Norman state, this is what it would have been under Henry I, under William the Conqueror, and under Henry I. Actually, they had Brittany too, and under William Rufus. So this would have been the Anglo-Norman state. Now look at this, the Angevin Empire. And here we have the old land of England, and here's Normandy, Brittany, and Maine. Added to it are all of Eleanor's lands, Tours and Poitou and Aquitaine and Gascony, all of this land here, plus the expansion going on in this direction, which Henry II had conquered Wales and Ireland. It was a sort of infiltration, a slow conquest of Wales and Ireland. So look at this enormous domain that he held as in the Angevin Empire. And here we see the different parts of that empire, the different important provinces. Okay, Brittany and Maine and Normandy were all parts of the Anglo-Norman state under William the Conqueror. Anjou was added when his mother married the Count of Anjou, when Henry II's mother married the Count of Anjou. And then when Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine, he got all of these lands as well, except Toulouse, which he's going to get later, actually. And so we can see all of these varied lands, and we will come back to this map from time to time as we look at the different provinces that are going on. And one more thing I want to show you is, here again is the Angevin Empire, and this yellow part is the domain of the King of France. Okay, that's all he ruled. Isn't that amazing? And so you think of the King of France as being just as important as the King of England, but not so. It's not right. Travis, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I can see how the 100 Years' War got started.
Well, that was kind of later, but yeah, the French always hated the English, and once they threw them out under Philip Augustus, when they threw them out of this French land, I mean, they never wanted the English back again. But and see, all of this area was ruled by independent counts who were, you know, they sort of gave lip service to serving the King of France, but in actuality they were totally independent. Whereas Henry II really had some control over these French domains that he ruled. Eleanor had control over those domains before she became the Queen of England. As counts of Poitou, the Dukes of Aquitaine had long ruled Poitou and Saintonge, and they were recognized as overlords of the counts of Angoulême, La Marche, and Périgord, and by the Vicomtes of Limoges. They acquired Gascony in the mid-11th century and became the overlords of Bordeaux, and the counties and lordships from the mouth of the Garonne to the Pyrenees. Okay, let me sort of look at these areas. Okay, here is Anjou. Poitou is here. Aquitaine is here. Limoges is here. La Marche is here. La Manche is here. Bordeaux is here. Guyenne, Auvergne, Gascony, and this is Toulouse, which they eventually get. If you can see all of those. I don't see where Saintonge is. I think Saintonge is somewhere in this area. Here is the river Garonne. And so as it comes in here, all of this to the south, they get all of the allegiance of all of those lords in Gascony. And so it's a tremendous realm. Eleanor's realm was larger than anybody's, larger than the King of France, larger than the King of England. I mean, it was enormous. In Poitou, which was in the northern part of Eleanor's realm, they spoke the northern French dialect. From Saintonge southward, they spoke Provençal or Occitan, which was a southern dialect. There is Languedoil in the north, which is named because of their word for yes, which is we, and there's Languedoc in the south because of their word for yes, which is oc, and so that's why it's called Occitania. All of that area to the south that Eleanor ruled is another name for that, taken from this word for the language, Occitan, so Occitania. The Counts of Aquitaine had taken a leading part in the wars against the Muslims in Spain, and Richard, on his father's side, Angevin, on his mother's side, was Occitanian. And so here we have a map of France which shows all the provinces of France, and of course all of these are the ones that belong to the Angevin Empire. His grandfather, Richard's grandfather, William IX of Aquitaine, was the first troubadour poet, and this should be a D instead of an F. My typing gets bad when I'm in a hurry. Okay, William IX of Aquitaine was a marvelous man, and he was the grandfather of Richard. He had a sense of humor, sometimes misinterpreted, but he turned everything into a joke. And he wrote all of these irreverent poems that were really incredibly funny. I have some here for you. This is supposed to be, this is not by Richard of Aquitaine, but it is supposed to be the very first poem in the courtly love genre in the south of France. Now the weather's getting bright, hi-ho, and the queen before our sight, hi-ho, joy and gladness to relight, hi-ho, and the jealous king excite, would show her amorous fancies. Chorus, go away, jealous man, go away, leave us pray, to dance alone, alone today. She has bidden all invite, hi-ho, none this side of the sea to slight, hi-ho, maids and bachelors polite, hi-ho, all are here and ever white to join the dance advances. And then the chorus. And then it goes on. But William IX of Aquitaine is the first poet that we can identify as one of the first poets. And here are a couple of his poems, just sort of snatches from them. This is a wonderful poem. I don't have the whole thing. A song I'll make you worthy to recall, with ample folly and with sense but small, of joy, young-heartedness, and love will I compound it all. And they're not all love poems. Here he sings about the spring. When verdant meadows reappear, and green invades the garden sere, and river and spring begin to clear, and zephyrs blow, the joy that fills our hearts with cheer must overflow, which is a celebration of spring. But a lot of his little songs are quite irreverent. And here's a picture of Poitou, where Richard was from. Let's see what the land looked like in that area. Okay. Okay, here is one of the palaces, the interior of the palace that Richard might have walked in Poitou. Okay, if we have time at the end, I'll read to you some of these other poems, because they're really good. I don't have one of Richard's poems, but I do have his grandfather's poem. So William IX of Aquitaine had a sense of humor and sometimes misinterpreted and turned everything into a joke. He was called the enemy of all chastity and accused of wanting to found an abbey of prostitutes. Because of the love poetry of the South, which was called courtly love, and they were love poems written by bachelor knights who would always write them. They're songs of unrequited love and longing and yearning, always for married ladies. And usually they were unrequited love, that they would never fulfill their longing to have the ladies. And they would say, oh, I long to hold you close to me, but your love I will never have. And so that's the kind of poems. And that's why he was accused of this loose living. He was alleged to have told a bald papal legate who had just excommunicated him for refusing to abandon his mistress that he would see the legate's hair in curlers before he gave her up. And so he was really irreverent, and he joked about excommunication, and he took the business of composing verse and music very seriously, though, and he wrote burlesque parodies and love lyrics. Very funny. One of them, if I can remember all of it, I'll write some verses just for fun, not for myself or anyone. I wrote them riding in the sun. My horse helped too, you know. And so there's a wonderful poem that he wrote. Richard also wrote music and poetry, not as good as that of William IX, and 2 of Richard's poems actually survive. Yeah, Travis?
They wouldn't have written in English, would they?
Oh, no. They would have written in Provençal, which is Old French, but it's the southern version of French, which is quite different from French today. It's more like Latin than it is French, and it's all pronounced differently than modern French or northern French. So Provençal is the language, or Aquitania is where they would do it. Courtly love was a new genre. It was the explosion of romantic love, and it came from the emphasis on the human side of Christ's nature, and that went hand in hand with an increasing veneration of Mary and a desire to explore human emotions. Okay, what they were trying to do was explore the emotion of love. How many different ways can we look at love and talk about how love exhibits itself, and what is human love? The lover was certain that his love was the source of everything good and worthwhile. Another of the troubadours, Bernard de Ventadorn, composed poetry at Henry II's and Eleanor's courts, and knights now went to war to glorify their ladies and not their ancestors or their reputations. Now they fought for their lady loves, even if they would never consummate that love with their ladies. And so this is the beginning of courtly love and the glorification of ladies who now were raised on a pedestal as the epitome of all that was good and gentle and kind and lovely, and the epitome of all good qualities. And the knights thought they were ennobled by simply knowing these beautiful ladies. Eleanor was reputed to have had a love affair with Bernard de Ventadorn between her marriages, but probably that's not true. Anyway, nevertheless, the rumor went around because of the nature of courtly love. And here's a picture of courtly love with the beautiful maiden being courted by the knight and his unrequited love for her. So this is a sort of vision of courtly love. And this is Eleanor, the marriage of King Henry II to Eleanor. Okay. Richard, as a son of this southern culture, could dance as well as fight and make polite conversation with ladies. Some northerners saw this culture as moral corruption, but the Duchy of Aquitaine was the most civilized province in France and a region of great wealth, and it was also the main supplier of wine to the English. And to quote an Englishman about the wine that was produced in England, English wine could be drunk only with closed eyes and through clenched teeth. Sorry, I've spelled teeth wrong there, but probably the English spelled it that way sometimes. All right. All right, I made a mistake here. This was not Richard and Margaret. This is Henry and Margaret. The young Henry and Margaret were indeed married in 1160. He aged 5 and she aged 3. And when this marriage took place, Henry II took the Norman Vexin. And the Norman Vexin is just on that southern border of Normandy, between Normandy and the Kingdom of France. Now Raymond of Toulouse divorced his wife Constance, sister of Louis VII, and did homage to Henry II. Henry needed to provide for his numerous children and needed the consent of Louis to be valid. But now he was an enemy of Louis because Raymond of Toulouse had switched sides and gone over to Henry. And here is Louis VII, seated on his throne as a ruler, not as a warrior. Henry planned for his eldest son to get the hereditary lands. This would have been Henry the Younger, would have gotten the hereditary lands, Anjou, Maine, Normandy, and England. And Richard was to get his mother's lands, Aquitaine and all that was associated with Aquitaine. After a serious revolt in Aquitaine, Louis agreed to a settlement. Richard would be recognized as Duke Designate of Aquitaine and betrothed to Louis's daughter Alice. Margaret disappeared from the records, the one he was supposed to be engaged to. Yeah. Oh, okay. But he was betrothed when he was a child to another Margaret, and she just disappears.
It was confusing because the Margarets, I was thinking it was Henry.
It was Henry who was engaged to the other Margaret at first, yeah. But now this engagement to Alice, this betrothal to Alice, is going to assume a large importance. But even because of the engagement, hostilities broke out again and the betrothal was annulled. Henry and Louis faced war. Louis made the comment to one of the chroniclers of England, "Your king, your lord the king of England, who lacks nothing, has men, horses, gold, silk, jewels, fruits, game, and everything else. Ah, but we in France have nothing but bread and wine and gaiety." And Walter Map, the chronicler, reports that it was merrily said and truly. So the King of England had everything, wealth and riches and power. The King of France had only wine and gaiety. In 1169, peace was made, and Henry II renewed his homage to Louis. Henry the Younger at this time did homage for Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, and Richard did homage for Aquitaine. The betrothal of Richard and Alice was at last finalized, and so they're not married, they're just betrothed at this time. Richard was probably with his mother during all these years, but in 1171 he emerges from obscurity. He and Eleanor laid the foundation stones for the Abbey of St. Augustine of Limoges at 1172, and that's his first appearance in the records. In 1172, at the age of 14, he was installed as Duke of Aquitaine in the Abbey Church of St. Hilary of Poitiers. He took his seat in the abbot's chair, and this is age 14, and he received from the hands of the Archbishop of Bordeaux and the Bishop of Poitiers the sacred lance and banner, which were the insignia of the ducal office. Next, he went to Limoges, and there he was proclaimed Duke in Limoges, where he received the ring of St. Valerie. Both of these ceremonies were a ritual expression of Aquitaine's de facto independence from King Louis, and perhaps also Richard's independence from Henry II. During these years, Henry and Eleanor became increasingly estranged. Eleanor was running the day-to-day business of Aquitaine, which was in the sole charge of Richard, but Eleanor was running everything. Now Henry's sons began plotting against him. Young Henry demanded his inheritance because Richard had gotten his, so young Henry wanted his. Eleanor then started plotting with the other sons, and she plotted with Richard and Geoffrey, who were in her charge. Eleanor at this point rallied her Poitevins to arms and sent Richard and Geoffrey to join young Henry at King Louis VII's court. It seems to have been Eleanor's decision alone to make war on Henry II. She wasn't influenced by any of her vassals, but she may have decided to go to war. She was a very strong woman, but she may have decided to go to war on her husband because her vassals balked at being seen as vassals of the King of England in future, because they didn't want to be subsumed under this huge Angevin Empire. So in 1173, Richard and his brothers attended a great court in Paris, and it was Louis VII, the King of France, who knighted Richard at age 16, and then they all went to war. Henry II, King Henry, subdued all of them but Richard, and then he made a truce with Louis. Richard was angered when Louis and the young Henry deserted him, but now, convinced that the cause was lost, he threw himself on his father's mercy. In 1174 to 1183, Richard served as Duke of Aquitaine, and the first thing he did at Henry's command was to level to the ground the castles of the rebels who were his former allies, and this, of course, instilled more rebellion among the people and his allies. His fighting, and strategic skills were honed in these years of warfare, subduing his own vassals. And so if you look at his career from the age of 14 onward, he was in constant warfare his whole life before he went on crusade. He spent his entire young manhood at war with either his father or his vassals or with somebody. I mean, he was always at war. He brought La Marche, Limoges, and the lordships of the Pyrenees to recognize his authority. Also the counts of Angoulême, and he had a greater authority than ever before, and even than his father had, or even the counts of Aquitaine before him. In 1182 to 1183, there was a make-or-break crisis of his reign. He was faced with many enemies, but all the Angevins, for once in their life, pulled together. All of the Henry II and all his sons worked together for once to save Aquitaine intact and united. And during all of those battles they had with the various counts of Aquitaine, the young king died. Henry II then summoned both Richard and John to Normandy. Geoffrey was still surviving at that time as well. His plan was to make Richard heir to England and Normandy and John Duke of Aquitaine, but Richard balked. He had fought for 8 long years to bring Aquitaine under his control, and he wasn't about to give it to his brother, even for the kingdom of England. And so he went away from the court and he told Henry, well, I'm just going to think this over for a while, but he said, I won't give it up. So Henry turned to his other son, John, and gave him permission to invade the duchy and try to take it by force. Finally, Henry ordered Richard to surrender Aquitaine to Eleanor, who was the rightful duchess, his own mother. And Eleanor had been in prison ever since she went to war against Henry. He actually captured her and put her in prison. Okay, now he said, okay, Richard, I'll let your mom out of prison if you'll give me back Aquitaine or give it to Eleanor. And so he did for the sake of his mother. That's a son's duty to his mother. So Eleanor got out of prison and she took Aquitaine back, and Richard laid down his arms and Eleanor was restored from prison. And just about that time, Jerusalem fell and a crusade was called in Europe. Outremer was on the verge of extinction. North of the Alps, Richard was the first prince to announce he was going on crusade. So Richard then took the bull by the horns and proclaimed that he was going on crusade. January 1188, at a meeting to make peace, Philip Augustus and Henry II also took the cross. It was agreed that the men of Philip Augustus were to wear red crosses, the men of the King of England were to wear white crosses, and the men of the Count of Flanders were to wear green crosses. And also, to finance the crusade, they began collecting a crusading tax called the Saladin tithe. They also passed a list of rules of conduct. The crusaders were not to swear or gamble, and the only women allowed were to be washerwomen of good character to go on this crusade. Because the crusaders liked to be neat and wear clean clothes, so they had to have washerwomen. But no other women were allowed. The crusaders themselves who went on crusade were exempt from paying the Saladin tithe. Now King Henry II, tried to hold Richard back until his inheritance was secure. And also at the same time, warfare with France was continuing and all the vassals were rebelling as usual. Henry was now very ill, and so he was in failing health. He was getting sicker and sicker. Finally, he set out for home to die, and he died at his castle at Chinon on the 6th of July, 1189, and was buried at Fontevraud. And here are the tombs of Eleanor and Henry at Fontevraud. Okay. John is also here, I think. And here is Richard Coeur de Lion, who is now King of England. On 13 September 1189, Richard was crowned in Westminster Abbey, And this is interesting that Richard himself picked up the crown from the altar and handed it to the Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him. And this is very symbolic because usually in England the Archbishop of Canterbury places the crown on the king's head as if he's acting for God. Okay, now if Richard hands the crown to the Archbishop of Canterbury, this means Richard has the authority to choose who is going to crown him. All of this is a big matter of dispute and negotiation throughout Europe as to who is going to crown kings in every kingdom, because the person who has the right to crown the king also has the right to choose the king. And so this is what's important about it. Richard spent the next year preparing for crusade. In terms of troops, war equipment, and money, he outshone all other leaders of the crusades. He had a massive scale of preparation. He was the first crusader to equip and take his own fleet to Outremer, and England, of course, was a maritime kingdom, and so this is what he did. Okay, and here is a Norman caravel that would have been the kind of ship that he would have taken a whole huge fleet in order to take these. And here is the route. He sailed the whole way. He didn't go overland. He actually sailed, I think, from Marseille or from one of those French ports in the south of France in Aquitaine. And so he sailed the whole distance, as we can see on this map. Here is the money, the coin by Richard Lionheart in England. He didn't coin it himself, but with his Crusader cross on the back, and Richard as king with his scepter on the front. And here are the knights setting off for the crusade, and Richard Lionheart at Acre. These, of course, are imaginary drawings of Richard and his valiant fighting. Okay, so now Richard is on his way to the Holy Land and going there to fight the Crusades. And we have our account of the Crusades. It's interesting that the very first chapter of Book 1 in our account of the Crusades says that the reason the people of the Holy Land were being exterminated by Saladin was because God was permitting the rod of his fury, Saladin, to rage and exterminate the obstinate people. In other words, they saw Saladin as punishment for their own sins. Okay, which is an interesting view. Various disasters foretold the approaching destruction, famine, earthquakes, and frequent eclipses, both of the sun and the moon. Okay, and then we've got the story. Yeah.
Seems that the Muslims that were in the Holy Land before the Crusaders came saw the Crusaders as a punishment for their past sins as well.
Yes, yes. Isn't that interesting? You know, do you see a lot of similarities between the Muslims and the Christians at this point? What kind of similarities do you see between them all? Anybody?
To eradicate each other.
Yeah, they want to eradicate each other, right.
The other was the infidel.
The other was the infidel, yeah. Except the Christians, at first, they didn't want to convert or eliminate them. They simply wanted the land in Jerusalem. They wanted the Holy Land. It was only when after the Muslims attacked them and started killing them that they wanted to kill back, slaughter them. So, but then they both wanted to slaughter each other. The Siege of Acre was probably the most violent of the battles that they had. And the miracles, a collection of miracles took place at the siege. I thought those were very interesting. What did you think about the miracles at the Siege of Acre? Anybody remember those? Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of wonder about the validity of them. I mean, they just seem a little too magical.
Too miraculous.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well,
having someone be struck through all of his armor by a crossbow bolt and then having it stopped by a piece of parchment only because it has the name of God on it.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, or having that great rock thrower crash through everything and then just bounce a rock off this guy's back and not feel anything.
You wonder if the rock maybe had lost momentum or something. I mean, I always try to look for a rational explanation of the miracles, but part of all of the Christian texts are collections of miracles, and when there are collections of miracles, it is a prelude, an expectation that the person will be sainted. And so that's what this suggests. Yeah.
Well, the miracles are becoming a crusader tradition. After the first crusade in Antioch, I believe it was, where they found the lance.
Right. Yeah. So, but miracles are pervasive in all of the saints' lives and all of the chronicles of Europe. I mean, there are always miracles somewhere. Interestingly, the Muslim chronicles don't have miracles in them, do they? So this is one way they're different. They don't really have miracles. But here we have God actually intervening. The Muslim chronicles more see God's guiding hand of everything, but they don't really talk about supernatural kinds of events. Okay. An unarmed knight in the middle of answering a call of nature is attacked by a Turk armed with a lance and knocks him down with a stone. Okay, that was an interesting miracle. A Turk's horse is caught in a net. Ditto, a Turk's horse is caught in a net. A Turk bringing Greek fire to the city by swimming is caught in a net by our fishermen. Okay, I won't read some of these. Anyway. Okay, Baldwin, Archbishop of Canterbury, is there also at the time, and he dies during this. But then a harsh famine hits them in the famine of the winter of 1190 to 91. Perishing with hunger, our people devour the corpses of their horses, including the offal. An offal here means like liver and heart and kidneys, and that's what's called offal in the Middle Ages. It is said that needs drives folks to crime and intercedes for mercy for them, and God created all things for humanity and gave them into our hands so that they might be a help for us. So rather than let humans die while beasts of burden were spared, they slew their precious war horses and consumed the horse flesh with pleasure, sometimes without having even skinned the animals first. A horse's offal was sold for 10 shillings. They flocked together eagerly anywhere a horse was known to have been killed, either to buy or to steal. Starving people rushed in crowds to the corpses of dead animals like vultures to a corpse. They devoured the bodies of their mounts. Those who used to carry them, vice versa, they now carried in their stomachs. A horse was worth more dead than alive. This part of the gospel seems not inappropriate for them. Wherever the carcass is, there will the vultures gather. The mystic interpretation aside, we are not intending to detract from its dignity. Such was the pressure of famine that when they had slaughtered a horse, none of the offal was regarded as waste. Every part, no matter how vile, was greatly valued, and so on. Anyone who had any food ate it in secret. Those who used to live in luxury now ate grass. The people perish from the rains and hunger. Okay, the Siege of Acre is horrible. The starving fight at the bakehouse. The starving nibble bones gnawed by dogs and consume filth. Even noblemen steal when they cannot afford to buy bread. Then hear the voice of the people cursing the Marquis' perfidy, for he's indifferent to their suffering and all their misery. Each little story ends with a little poem. Many people apostatized because of the severity of the famine. This cannot be related or heard without deep sorrow. Some of our people broke down in the face of the excessive severity of the famine, winning salvation for their bodies, but incurring damnation for their souls. After the greatest tribulation had been partly overcome, they fell away and fled to the Turks. not hesitating to apostatize from their faith to prolong their temporal life a little, they won perpetual death with wicked blasphemies. O calamitous exchange! O shameful crime! Worthy of what punishment? And they converted to Islam to get food from the Turks. And so on the starving consume carobs and die from drinking wine. Okay, I think carobs are beetles. No, they're not. They're carobs. What we think of as carobs, sweet tasting, enclosed in a pod like peas. The needy filled themselves with them because there was a larger supply than of other things, and they died from them. Okay. Wine made them overheat, and very many of them choked. Those who are starving consume meat in Lent. With the encouragement of the Bishop of Salisbury and some others, the wealthy made a collection to feed the poor. And then finally a ship arrived with a cargo of grain and saved them all. And then everybody eagerly bestowed the food on the poor, and those who ate forbidden food gave penance. Now the kings of England and France arrive. They have eagerly taken the cross, and they arrive in the Holy Land. Okay, it has Count Richard of Poitou is crowned King of England. King Henry dies. He settles the affairs of his kingdom, and then he goes on crusade and orders his fleet to go on ahead, sailing around Spain and through the straits, and to wait for him at Messina. Okay, so he's still on his way. And then when he gets to Sicily, he stays in Sicily for the winter, and King Richard's sister, the Queen of Sicily, is there, and his sister is married to the King of Sicily. I think it's King William. And then his mother brings his intended wife, and she's married there on the crusade. Eleanor actually goes, I think. Where are they married? Yeah.
It's not William, it's Tancred.
Oh, it's Tancred. Okay, Tancred. Thank you. Okay, Eleanor and Berengaria, Queen Eleanor arrived, hurrying after him. She brought with her a noble young woman, the daughter of the King of Navarre. Her name was Berengaria, the king's intended wife, and the wedding takes place in Sicily. Okay. And after a short stop, he gave his mother, the queen, leave to go and asked her to take over the guardianship of his kingdom, jointly with the aforementioned Archbishop Walter of Rouen. Okay, so then they have the wedding ceremony. A wonderful description of the wedding ceremony, I think, to hear a royal wedding. Okay, and then they arrive at Acre, and he ends up conquering the whole area. Okay, we've run out of time, but we sort of looked at Richard's character and Richard's career as a warrior, and then he spends his time in the Holy Land as a great warrior. He is certainly the equal of Saladin, and so we have two great heroes facing each other. Okay, now we're going to move on, now that we've seen these great heroes, and we're going to look at the Fourth Crusade and the Northern Crusades, which really take place simultaneously. So that's what we'll do for next week.
Thank you.